What's crappin'? Stop yapping and build some shit. Cordell Roof is the third here. Today we're going to do a large case diff swap on the E36 M3. So a lot of guys have said they've done this and don't have any videos or pictures or whatever. We've already ran into some issues and I haven't been able to find any information on any of this stuff on the internet. So hopefully we can walk through a lot of that stuff with you guys today. But as of right now, we have the E32 750IL large case diff. It's a 210 millimeter diff. The Rally Road kit, which comes with the ear mount on the rear. It's all billet aluminum. And the front welding mount, which you'll see later. One of the things to note is that this 6-bolt differential flange on here is not the same pattern as the 6-bolt flange up front. So what we had to do was actually drill a second set of holes in here for this flange to accept the BMW 4-bolt, and hopefully that'll work well. We also have the drive shaft shop adapter, which didn't work because of our 6-bolt, because the 6-bolt pattern is not the same. This is the 6-bolt pattern of the CV, which is not the same as the 6-bolt pattern up front. So we'll use this as a spacer if need be, if the drive shaft isn't long enough to put this thing in there. We're going to be changing all this stuff out anyway when we go to the 2J, but I want to get all this stuff installed beforehand so we don't have to mess with it later. And then everything else should be pretty straightforward. I don't know if the speed sensor will work the same. We'll wire that in and see if that stuff works. And we'll get the speedo working as well on the E36. But this is pretty much everything I think we'll need to be able to get this thing up and running. And this is where that bracket should end up locating to be welded in the front and solid mount up front. And those ears on the back get rid of this rubber mount. So this is all solid mounted after we put that in there. So we'll see how everything lines up. We'll bring you guys along for the road and we'll see how all this stuff goes in. Okay, well, we got the differential out. Obviously we have our 4-bolt. Just so you guys know, if you have an E36 M3 that has a 6-bolt, basically one of these CVs on the end of the drive shaft, that 6-bolt pattern is the same as the CVs. It is not a different 6-bolt pattern like you would find on the E32 input shaft flange for the diff. So all you really had to take out here was obviously this front bolt. There's 2 bolts in the ears in the back of the diff, and then the drive shaft and the 2 CVs. And then here we'll take a look at the difference between these two diffs. So this is the 1998 E36 M3 differential. I believe this is a 188 millimeter diff. And then over here we have the E32 210 millimeter diff out of the E32 750 IL. It's a much heavier diff just in weight. And supposedly it is much stronger, and 210 millimeters is about 8.260 in inches, so it is fractionally smaller than a Ford 9-inch rear end with an LSD in it, so it's obviously very stout. Also, the Rally Road kit gets rid of these bushings that are in here, so this ends up being solid mounted aluminum to the rear, and then obviously solid mounted up front when we weld that bracket in, and that bracket will end up straddling here, and that is where it gets welded in. But for right now, we're going to try to get this diff up in there and see how well it fits. Hopefully it fits and we don't have any issues. Another thing also that I haven't been able to find any info on is this speed sensor. So this is the speed sensor from the E36. It looks like it is a similar bracket to that of the E32. So what I'm going to try to do is swap those brackets and see if that will work on there. As long as that sensor gear is swinging in between the sensor, it should give a reading. And as long as that, I believe that gear is this the same number of teeth as the normal 188, but we'll find out. I mean, if the speedo's off, we'll try to wire that sensor in to the other diff, so we'll give that a shot too, see how all that stuff works out. So we'll keep pushing forward, switch back over to the time lapse. Okay guys, so far this swap is not super straightforward. So we've had to drop the subframe as far down as we can, hoping we can get the diff to go up in there. The problem is the back of the diff hits the tank, so we're not able to get enough angle to clear the front input flange here and get it up in there. One of the cool things though so far is the, well, here, I'll show you here. This is the E36 M3 Speedo sensor, and it seems to be the same as the other one, aside from this. The version in the E32 is asymmetric, so it's not symmetrical on both sides. The left tab is a little shorter. This one is symmetrical, but it doesn't hit anything, so we're gonna try it in here and just see if it works. And then if it doesn't, we'll wire in the E32 one and see if that works. But so far we've had obviously a few hiccups. I don't know if any of this stuff is exactly normal for putting in the E32 diff into the E36, but I mean, we're just kind of dealing with this stuff as we go along. There's not a whole lot of info out there on any of this stuff, so hopefully we have enough plunge in the drive shaft to be able to bolt to the input flange, and then also we need enough plunge in the axles to be able to spread them out wider, because the E32 is a little wider. And then our next issue is going to be where these brackets actually locate the diff under the car, which should give us some more room up front, but right now it looks like they might actually be backwards, but I don't know. We'll take a look at that once we get it up there. So we'll keep moving forward. So what they don't tell you is you got to cut out this front mount bracket that's normally right here for the E36 diff. You got to cut that all out. Then you're gonna have to grind a lot of this back to get this bracket to fit. And it looks like this is how the bracket's supposed to fit. This ear up top ends up being on the inside of that bracket of the cross member, and then this side ends up kind of riding flush with the edge of the cross member. And then obviously we'll clean all this up so we can get a nice weld on it. And we'll put the diff up in there first, and we'll make sure it all fits, and we'll keep trying to get this fucking thing to fit. So we'll show you the bracket that was actually in there. So this is the stock bracket that's in there for the stock diff. It sits in there like that, so you got to cut this whole thing out. There's a weld on the front, a weld on this edge, and then a weld on the back side underneath. If you can cut these two out and this backside one with the cutoff wheel, you can get the reciprocating saw in here enough to where you can work this out and snap that weld. That's the easiest way to do it. So then we got this cross member dropped a couple inches, so we can hopefully fish the diff up in there, and then we can get that bracket lined up and hopefully weld this thing in there. So we'll see how well this all fits in a few minutes. So we got the subframe back up in there. The bracket is mounted to the diff, but is not welded yet. This is where it gets welded, obviously underneath, and then we'll throw some seam welds, try to wrap the corners up here. The axles bolt up fine. The obvious issues are with the drive shaft. So this drive shaft is obviously not going to bolt up to this flange. We're gonna have to pull the drive shaft out and get it shortened. and we'll probably just shorten it enough to be able to throw this adapter in there, even though we're not going to be using this adapter in the way that it's intended. We will be able to use this on the end of the drive shaft as a register on the center bore of this, and then this edge as a register on the front face of the input flange, which should keep everything concentric. And we'll just go from there. But for the most part, this has been a lot more work than as originally advertised. So and we'll make sure that we put a gap in here. We'll push up on this with the jack to get, you know, a 1/16 or so gap in here before we weld on this bracket. But our next order of business is to pull the drive shaft, figure out how much we want to pull out of it, and then we'll go from there. Obviously, when we put the other engine in this car, because this car is getting the 2JZ eventually, we'll have a custom-made drive shaft by Drive Shaft Shop, I'm sure, made with the larger 4-bolt GM flange, I believe is what they use. But we'll see. For now, this will work just so I can keep driving the car, and we can try out the diff. So we'll keep moving forward. Well, this is where we're at, guys. We got everything bolted up in there, but the issue we're having is that the drive shaft is obviously too long to bolt up to our flange, and we also have an adapter that we're using to kind of center everything. So we have to take 2.5 inches out of the drive shaft, which is what those two old people over there are getting ready to do. And if you take your BMW drive shaft somewhere to get it serviced, they will tell you that they cannot service your BMW drive shaft because they're fused. So you can't shorten the drive shafts. So we're gonna have to rig something up for now that will work until we get a custom drive shaft done. So we have to pull 2.5 inches out of that drive shaft and hope that it's decently balanced, and then we can get this thing all bolted up in here, and we'll give that a shot. Whatever. Okay, now we got Papa Smurf 2.0 over here. If y'all are looking to do some custom fabrications, y'all need to find a Smurf of your own, an Italian lawn gnome of sorts. So what we're doing right here, we got this diff jacked up to where we got a little bit of an air gap in between the cross member and the diff. It's about 1/8 inch, maybe 100 thou. We just want a little bit of a gap there before we start welding up this puppy. Yeah, just weld that on there. And we'll MIG that fucker up there. Go, just squirt it on there. You got the JB weld loaded in there?
Got it.
All right. And how long does it take before that's dry?
24 hours.
24 hours before that's dry.
It's dry. Got to dry for 24 hours.
All right.
Yeah.
We're gonna play it safe and wait 36.
Yep. Needs to be safe.
We got some weld up in there. Once you loop that bottom, that thing ain't going nowhere. And just like every direction on the internet, once all the custom fabrication is done, it's a direct bolt-in kit. While he's welding that in, I'll show you guys. We had to cut 2.5 inches out of the drive shaft. This is by no means recommended, but you can't really cut up the BMW drive shafts because they're friction welded here. So there's no sleeve or anything, so we had to make a sleeve. Then we're gonna take the area back in. We have it scribed to line up the factory balance weights just to get us close. And then hopefully this will be good enough just to drive the car until we get the other custom drive shaft in here and the other tranny. So this is just temporary, and we'll keep moving forward. Alright, so we got her back together. This is where we spliced in. Obviously you can see the paint, perfect match. We spliced in a sleeve, rosetted it, and seam welded it all tigged so we could shorten up the drive shaft 2.5 inches. If it vibrates a shit ton, we'll just yank it out, get it balanced. But we got the whole thing in there. We got the adapter plate we really didn't need, but we used it to align the center of the drive shaft into the adapter, and then the adapter registers on the front face of the input flange to the diff. And then obviously we got everything welded in. Now it's time to put all the pans and shit back up, take her for a drive, and see how bad she vibrates on the freeway. Pretty cool. E32 750 IF diff install in an E36. Pain in the ass, don't do it. Well, we're in the I have a 1998 E36 M3, and it's in friggin' mint condition. It was fully restored 20,000 miles ago, so it's in really good condition. We got the E32 large case 210 millimeter diff installed in here. It was a total pain in the ass. It was an entire day's worth of work. Luckily, my parents own an engineering company, so I was able to use a lot of their stuff. Obviously the welders, and then we jumped on the lathe and made a bunch of stuff, and we're able to make some registers for the drive shaft to fit up to the flange, the input flange on the E32 diff. Here's the thing with the E32 diff. The only reason you need that diff is if you're planning on making, 1200 horse or whatever. It's basically a Ford 9-inch with an LSD. It's a giant gear. When you pop the backside of that diff off, you can tell it's super beefy. So with that said, you probably have some fabrication capabilities. You're definitely not making 1200 horse at the tire on an engine that you bought off the shelf and just put in your car. Generally the people who are pushing the limits of engines up past 1,000 horsepower either have the money to pay somebody to fabricate the stuff, or you're like me and you fabricate all this shit yourself. With that said, there was a lot of things we didn't know when we got into this. When I got into this project, that became apparent pretty quickly. The first issue was that obviously the drive shaft was not going to fit, and the flange on the input flange on the diff was not correct for the drive shaft that we had. It is not correct for any of the drive shafts for an E36, so you have to either have an adapter, or you do what we did, and we actually took the drive shaft shop 6-bolt to 4-bolt adapter, and we modified it, and we basically turned down one end of it so that end would register in the input flange on the diff. Then we drilled through the 4 holes that were the 4-hole bolt pattern for the stock 4-bolt drive shaft for the E36. We drilled those through, and then we added bushings in there, and that allowed us to basically knock the studs out of the drive shaft on the E36, and we were able to use grade 10 bolts and just sandwich that plate, which you guys saw in the video. We sandwiched the adapter. We also milled the center. I spun it on the lathe and milled it, I believe it was 1.850. and that registers the actual drive shaft. So the adapter plate is concentric to the flange, and then the drive shaft is concentric to the adapter plate. So everything is concentric at that point. So we had everything should be pretty lined up. We also had to cut out the front diff, the stock diff mount. That became a little cumbersome, and then when we were trying to put in the large case diff, you don't have enough angle to get it up in there. You run into the gas tank. So what we ended up having to do was pull the front input flange off again after we had already Loctited it and set the preload. And we had to unbolt the subframe to drop the subframe down so we could get a little more angle, a little more room to get the diff up in there. Once we got the diff up in there, we had to yank the drive shaft out, and then we noticed that obviously we had to shorten up the drive shaft. Given the fact that it's a BMW drive shaft, nobody will shorten those. So we ended up cutting 2.5 inches out of it, sleeving it, rosette welding it, TIGging it up, and we made sure we scribed it first, so all of the balancing shims that were on it before were still in line the same way that they were. And driving it now, I don't have any vibration. We put the splice up towards the rubber bushing where the slip yoke is, which should help alleviate any vibration if there is any. And if there is, you don't really want the vibration towards the rear end. I mean, that's where all the money's at, you know. So and this is obviously all just temporary so we can keep driving the car, and then we'll have the one-piece drive shaft built when we do the 2J swap and throw the T36 Magnum in there. So as of right now, everything seems to be working really well. The axles and everything went in fine, even though the 210 diff, the actual dimension between the faces where the CV's bolt is actually wider by almost, I want to say almost an inch. But there's so much plunge in the axles that you're able to get away with it pretty easily. And everything registered really well there. All that stuff bolted up fine. It was just a matter of getting the diff in there. And then there was a good amount of grinding on the stock cross member that goes underneath the diff to get the brackets to clear and to be able to have access to that bolt that goes in the front of the large case diff through the rally road bracket. But once we got that stuff in there and we were able to get the drive shaft shortened, everything bolted up pretty well, and it works really well now. One of the cool things is, so I was able to throw my stock speed sensor into the E32 diff. It's the exact same hole size, so the O-ring, everything bolted straight in there. And then I just checked it with the GPS on my phone, and the speedo's dead on. So all that stuff bolted right over. I just literally plugged it right in, which was really cool. The other thing we had to do was we ended up jacking up the diff to give us a little bit of room under the cross member, just so we had a little bit of an air gap so we wouldn't run into any vibration issues. But aside from that, you know, I mean, it was a full day of work, but for what you're getting out of it, it's not, you know, it's a drop in the bucket. It was definitely a lot more work than what we thought it was going to be. But I guess, you know, everybody's application is different. And, you know, obviously we didn't get directions with any of this stuff. They just give you the billet piece for the rear ears to be able to bolt it up, which bolted up fine. And then the front bracket that bolts to the large case diff that gets welded in. And we make that all in there. So that thing's not coming out anytime soon. But so far, there's not a lot of vibration in the car, not a lot of rear end noise. You would think there would be more because you're solid mounting the diff in the car, but there isn't really. And this car is loud as it is anyway. And then I don't have any vibration on the drive shaft that I can notice. And since we sleeved that shaft, there's no way that shaft's gonna come apart. There's just flat out not enough room for it to physically come apart. And I already did a couple burnouts and made sure the diff was moving around because the diff was dry. And then we used Royal Purple, I think it's 140.95. I have to double check, but we threw the good royal purple rear end oil in there for the LSDs. It took about almost 2 quarts. It was about 1 3/4 quarts. So if you're gonna do the swap, beware. It is it's gonna take some work. You're gonna need some tools. You're gonna need to shorten up your drive shaft. You're probably gonna have to drill some holes in that input flange, and that input flange and the drive shaft need to be concentric, so you got to figure out a way to do that. But you know, it was all done in a day, and we were luckily I have the resources to do that. Not everybody, and most people will not, but it turned out really good. I drove it. I'm almost all the way home, so pretty cool.